Good afternoon, Titanic community and the international Titanic community. We are right now live at the Harmony Grove Cemetery in Salem, Massachusetts. And this cemetery is very significant because Elizabeth Lines, the famous first class passenger who overheard the conversation between J. Bruce Ismay and Captain Smith, she is buried here in this wonderful, huge cemetery. I am here because I'm going to do an interview about my book, but I'm also here to remember her and all the other passengers who sailed on the Titanic and all the passengers who died on the Titanic, but also the passengers who lived through that disaster and somehow were able to carry on their lives. And my friend Nico Carver is going to be asking me some questions about my book. And there's two copies out. One is in paperback and the other is in hardcover. So, Nico, go ahead. Ask away.
So, Douglas, what motivated you to write this book?
Well, the motivation to write my Titanic book actually was because of COVID-19. When everybody was going into a panic and people didn't know what to do and people didn't know, whether or not they were going to go back to work and just all this uncertainty. So I started writing this book. Actually, I started writing it in a couple of articles because I had written articles about Titanic before, and I had shared, some of my ideals about the sinking of the Titanic and my understanding of it to a couple of historians. And I started sharing these articles with George Behe, the ex-vice president of the Titanic Historical Society. And I asked him about what did he think about my articles, and he was like, these articles are very good. Have you thought about putting all of these articles into a self-published book? And I said no. And he was like, well, you really should do it because these are really good. So I'm like, you know what, if George Behe thinks that I can write a self-published book, I'm going to try. And I did try to write a self-published book years ago, but it was terrible. I think I was like 17, 18 years old and inexperienced. So I started in September of 2020, and I started writing about 10 pages, and I shared these via email with George Behe, and he was like, you do a much better job than I do, summarizing oceanliner history from the 1840s to the 1900s. He was like, keep going. So I just kept going, and every single day I wrote about 10 pages by hand and on computer as well. I would write it on a notepad. Some of the notes and things, and just all these things I remember off the top of my head from reading all these books for about 25 years of my life. And it started to come together, and the more I shared with George Behe, and my original plan was to keep the book to under 100 pages, but I failed in that regard. And he was like, well, in your book, Titanic is not even in the water. She's not even launched yet. Are you sure you can stick to 100 pages? I'm like, no. And he was like, if you can't, that's okay. Just keep going. And it took me about 2 months to write about 150 pages. And by November of 2020, I was done with the first draft. And then from that point forward, the difficult process of editing that book took about 6 months with the help of my close friend's mom, Francesca Forrest, who is also the editor of my book. So,
great. And what's a common misconception about the Titanic?
There are lots of common misconceptions about the Titanic, but the ones that seem to be making the news and sensationalism seem to be the Titanic was on fire, which she was on fire. Her coal bunker. But it was a small, benign fire. It wasn't anything serious, anything, that threatened the integrity or the safety of the ship at all. These coal bunker fires were very common on coal-burning ships. And but that seems to be a controversy in the Titanic community that seems to be brought up every couple of years. And of course, the misconception, another one, is Titanic was switched with the Olympic. That's another one. I'm not going to go into that today. I will leave that up to the historians. I'm just a Titanic enthusiast. And the misconception that Titanic was poorly built.
Why is the Titanic still relevant today?
I think her lessons. I think, the story of Titanic resonates with humanity because it's a story of complacency. It's a story of arrogance. It's also a story of faith in technology. And I think it's just a story of mankind. And I just think that Titanic is always going to be a metaphor for all the lessons, that mankind continues to fail to heed.
In your opinion, who was the most critical figure in the Titanic disaster?
That's a very good question. There are a lot. I think the top three on my list would probably be J. Bruce Ismay, Captain Smith, and I also think Charles Lightoller is another one that I can think of. I say J. Bruce Ismay because he is such a controversial figure. He was the chairman of the White Star Line. He was the president of the International Mercantile Marine. And he is such a controversial figure because he lived when so many people died, and he was vilified for it. And I was one of those people for many, many years. I had a very black and white view of him. I felt that he was the chairman of the White Star Line. Why did he live when so many of his passengers or passengers and crew under his company's authority died? But I think as I got older and started talking with other historians and started to think about him, and I've made a video about it on my YouTube channel. You can go and watch that. There's 2 parts to that video. As I started to think about J. Bruce Ismay more and more, I realized that he is a very complex person. And as a matter of fact, I'm trying to write a fictional memoir about J. Bruce Ismay. And the fictional memoir would basically be, what if J. Bruce Ismay's wife did not forbid him from talking about the Titanic? What if he was able to say his truth? What would that memoir of his life, from the time that he was born to the time that he died in 1937, what would that memoir look like? And so I haven't finished it yet. I'm only at about 8,000 to 10,000 words. But I think about him all the time. And even though I am, an author of a Titanic book and I have accepted the historical evidence, I still have my own opinion of him. And, I try not to let my personal opinion cloud the historical evidence, but he is the most controversial figure.
What about the Titanic speaks to you personally?
Well, that got started back in 1996. This is before Cameron's movie came out. This is before YouTube. This is before Facebook. This is before Twitter. And what got me started was in the 4th grade at Dorman Elementary School in Springfield, Massachusetts. And 2 of our 4th grade classes were doing a general reading curriculum, like all elementary schools have a general reading curriculum. And we were reading out of this book, just general basic reading lessons and writing lessons. And the Titanic story was in there, and it was about a ship that was declared to be unsinkable or perceived to be unsinkable, sinks, gets lost, and then gets rediscovered in the bottom of the North Atlantic Ocean in 1985. And that just fascinated me. It just stuck with me from that point forward. And it was a 2-week curriculum. It was a big, huge curriculum that we did. And at the end of the 2-week curriculum of that reading plan that they did, 2 of the 4th grade classes got together. We watched a documentary, a children's documentary, of course, on the Titanic, and they had blueberry juice and vanilla ice cream to symbolize the iceberg, and so that just got me hooked. But before I was into Titanic and ocean liners, I was into buses, city buses, and school buses in particular, and tornadoes. So my friends always seem to say that I seem to be into some form of destruction by Mother Nature and public transportation or some form of transportation. So.
Great. And last question. What's one thing you think people should understand about the Titanic and its fate?
I think people should understand the Titanic and its fate as overconfidence in technology, overconfidence in their experience, overconfidence in their skills, and just to understand that it wasn't just one thing that took the Titanic into the North Atlantic Ocean with 1,496 people. It was little things that all added up to the big. It's getting windy out here. To the big disaster. And when I wrote this book, it took me 2 months to write this book. It took 8 months to edit the book. My editor, Francesca Forrest, and me went back and forth. And then I really want to say thank you to George Behe for taking the time to final proof my book, for corresponding with me via email. I'm not considered to be a big wig in the Titanic community or in the Titanic world, and that's okay. I love Titanic in my own way. And it's always been a part of my life. I'm 36 years old now, and it's been a part of my life since I was a child. And I think in the 21st century, I think it's important to keep Titanic's memory alive, because my fear is, as the original Titanic historians like George Behe, Don Lynch, and the people that I grew up to reading their books in my childhood, as they fade away, unfortunately, I sort of feel like I sort of feel and I fear that Titanic's history will also fade away, because I feel like as time goes by, anytime there's a death or there's a natural disaster or, a major man-made disaster, the first 2 to 3 years people remember it. It's raw, it's fresh. And then we sort of kind of pick up our lives and kind of try to go on. And I feel like because it's been 110 years ago, and I sort of feel like we're moving towards the 150-year mark, I sort of feel like Titanic's memory will fade. But I'm hopeful because of technology that's keeping Titanic alive through these, real-time syncing and through these virtual reality games and these online forums and stuff. And there's always going to be people who are going to be fascinated by it, and there's always going to be that one child in the world, like I was, that's going to get hooked to it. And that's my hope, that future generations will keep it alive. And it's also the story of the safety of life at sea. I call Titanic the Maritime Civil Rights Act, because there's a before and after Titanic, right? Before Titanic, you could make those arguments and say, well, we can't get these lifeboats off. They're too big. They're 5 tons. They're 30 feet long. We don't have enough crews to man them. These ships are practically unsinkable. The watertight compartments are sound. There's 300 North Atlantic ocean liners out there. And then Titanic sank, and all that changed. And you can never go back to those arguments again. So there's a before and after. And my fear, this is my personal fear. My personal fear is there will be another Titanic with a modern cruise ship. And the question won't be that the cruise ship didn't have enough lifeboats. The question will be, how come we couldn't get 5,000, 6,000 people off of this ship? That's my fear. I really do think. And I'm not a fan of cruise ships. I mean, I know they are the heirs of ocean liners, but I'm not a fan of them, and I am afraid that a rogue wave or something is going to take one of these cruise ships out. Except the Queen Mary too. They're not going to take that one out. She's a true North Atlantic liner. They're not taking her out, but the rest of them, God help them. So that's it, and we are in Salem, Massachusetts. Thank you very much for asking me those questions. And God bless those people who died on the Titanic, and God bless those people who had to live through it.